let's jump in. Okay, so these Legos are kind of interesting. So if I take one, let's take this one. Let's take that one. If I take this one Lego, it's not that exciting, right? It's just a black, kind of shiny. It's a little small, not too big. On its own, it's not that great, right? Now, there are a couple here that are a little more flowery and things like that. But the truth is, one Lego by itself is not that great. But when you start to piece it together, all of a sudden you have this really cool, what did we call this? The Monster Fun House. That's broken, I'm sorry. But we have the Monster Fun House, right? Because when you bring those pieces together, all of a sudden you create something really cool. Well, here's what I want to say. God has wired you and me with a bunch of different stuff that make us up, that make us who we are. It's like little Legos. So one of your Legos may be your gender. We're not going to go there tonight, don't worry. Gender. One of your Legos could be the parents that you had. One of the Legos of your life could be your personality. One of the Legos of your life could be the area that you grew up in, the economic status that you had, the person that you married, the job that you took, the city that you live in. We could go on and on and on. Your spiritual gifts, what God's given you as talents. So God has taken, if you will, a bunch of Lego pieces, and when you bring them together, you get the picture of you. And so sometimes it's good to pull apart the Legos and look at them individually and try to better understand ways that God has wired, created us, gifted us, and ultimately inspired us to live this life He's given us. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to look at what I would consider as one of those Legos. Now there's a passage of scripture you may have heard before. It's very familiar from Psalm 139. Let me read it to you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You ever heard that before? Do you believe that? Let me tell you something. That's an important verse. The whole Bible's important. I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but that's an important verse. And that's what I want to do tonight. I want to look at something that I think is going to be helpful. Now, we're going to talk about birth order tonight. So here's the big question. Do you know when you were born? How many of you were firstborn children? Raise your hand. Look around. All right. Put your hand down. How many of you were second-born, middle child? How many of you were last-born? You were the last one born. All right, now put your hands down. I can't forget you. How many of you were only children? 1, 2, 3, 4. Interesting, huh? Now, here's what's cool. If we look at birth order, if we look at the different orders in which we were born, what we find is our birth order actually has radical implications on our personality. What we're going to see is there's some positive things, there's some dark things that we need to look out for, but what's also interesting is just like it affects us, it affects our children. So understanding how our children are being formed because of the order in which they were born can be really helpful for us as parents. And so that's what I want to look at tonight. Now, I got to say a couple of things. First, understand that these are not traits that you are born with. What we're going to talk about tonight, these are not traits you are born with. There's something that formed by the environment in which you're in, okay? So firstborn children aren't born with these traits, but because they are firstborn children in a family, they tend to acquire or formulate to these traits. The other thing I want to point out is that these are tendencies, not guarantees. Okay, so some of these you may go, that's not me, and that's okay. But what you're going to notice for the majority of us, you're going to go, wow, that's totally me, or that's totally my son, or that's my daughter, or that's my last born. It makes so much sense now. I understand. All that's going to happen tonight, but remember that they are tendencies, not guarantees. Okay, so let's jump in. Firstborn children, raise your hand one more time. Where are you at? Okay, so this is the majority of the room. That's wonderful because I am a firstborn child, and I think we are the greatest, but I shouldn't say that because it's not fair. So I won't say that we're the greatest. I'll just imply that we are the greatest. Now, firstborn children, we get the picture that firstborn children, they're like seated on a throne. Okay? They're not kings and queens, but they feel like they are King Kong or Queen Kong because they are the firstborn. They are the oldest. They feel like they are in control of everything. Some of you are going, yes, I remember that from my childhood. My brother, my sister. Now let's look at some attributes, some positive attributes of firstborn children. Okay? So look up here behind me. So they're natural leaders. They're aggressive. They're perfectionists. Stop hitting your husband. They're dependable. They're organized, and they're driven. These are some of the positive qualities of a firstborn child. Now, what we see in these is that maybe you're a firstborn and you look at this and you go, well, I don't see all of those, but I see most of those. Let's think about a natural leader. Why would they be a natural leader? Well, the firstborn with other children behind, what did mom do, right? Mom raised you, and then the second one came and said, okay, you're up. You change his diaper. You feed him. You take him to bed. Let him sleep with you. We're done with that. We already did it with you, right? So they naturally build some leadership tendencies because us as parents tend to let them be in the driver's seat in some of those areas. So these are some positive things. They take charge. They also have high standards. How many of you remember this with your firstborn? The standard was sky high because you didn't even know what that meant. You raised the bar high, and then the third one came, and you're like, as long as you don't die, it's cool, right? It's just a totally different perspective that we see. And so for firstborn children, they're natural leaders, they're aggressive, they're perfectionists, they're dependable, they're organized, they're driven, typically because we set the bar so high. We need to remember that, though, about our firstborns. That can be a really great thing, but that can also push them to some dangerous places if we're not careful with that. We want to watch that. Let's think about some famous firstborn children. Put up the first one. Anybody know this guy? Clint Eastwood. He was a firstborn. I like that quote. I've never heard that before, but anyways. Firstborn. Let's talk about Clint Eastwood for just a minute. Now, I'm not really promoting his movies. I do want to be clear on that. I think 99.9% of them are all terrible, and I would not recommend watching them. But we can understand who he is just from the movies that he's made and the impact he's had on our culture. But think about Clint Eastwood. How did he start out? He started out as an actor. Okay, well, in his acting career, he started out as an actor. But what does he do now most of the time? Anybody know? He directs. Why do you think he directs? Most likely, here's what happened. He got sick of people telling him what to do. And he said, enough's enough. I'm taking control, right? Because I'm driven, I'm the leader, I'm dependable, I'm organized, so now he directs and oftentimes acts in his very own movies, right? So firstborns tend to be this way. Let's look at another one. Anybody know this guy? Y'all know who that is, right? Some of you, yeah. Bush, George Bush. Did you know that over half of our presidents are firstborn children? Did you know that Donald J. Trump is not a firstborn child? Not a firstborn. It'll make a lot of sense when we get to the lastborn. If I have time to say it. Okay, now, one last positive thing, and here's important. On every birth order, I'm going to give you this kind of line. Firstborn children are capable of being highly successful in life and in marriage. Highly successful in life and in marriage. Now, let's talk about marriage for just a second. We're not talking about successful as in they divorce or not divorce. We're talking about the type of marriage that they operate. So Sarah and I are both firstborn children. So we have our marriage by default, without even trying, we like to accomplish things. We lead ministries, we lead a business, we have jobs, we do all these things. And so we're highly driven in this area where some couples may be a little bit more about having fun. They just want to enjoy the season, right? And we're kind of like, yeah, we want to have fun, but we also are on a mission, right? We're on a mission for the Lord, first and foremost. Don't forget that. But that's how we operate. So firstborn children tend to have highly successful marriages because that's how they're wired. But firstborn children have a dark side. Here's what they are. They think they're always right. They can be insensitive. If they're not careful, they can run you over. They can be highly critical. They can be impatient, and they tend to worry. Again, maybe not every single one of these. Firstborn children are best described as approval-seeking missiles. Approval-seeking missiles. Why do you think that is? Do you remember what happened with your firstborn child? When they took their first step, what did you do? celebrated. When they ate their first bite, no more bottle, you celebrated. When they did this and they did that, you celebrated, you celebrated, you celebrated, you celebrated everything because it was the first one. You'd never seen that before. And then the fourth one came and you were like, oh, it's about time. We've been waiting for you to take your first bite and to change your own diaper. I don't know if that ever happens, but that's good parenting if you figured that one out, right? So they tend to be approval-seeking little missiles because everything they did was celebrated and they become wired that way. Second-born children, where are you at? This would also qualify as the middle children. So if there's 3, you're in the middle 2. Okay. Here's some good attributes. Well, first of all, if the firstborn's on the throne, quote unquote, right? The secondborn is the dethroner. Takes that throne right from him, right? I think about our kids. We have a 4-year-old Kyla and a 2-year-old Kason. When Kyla first came, right, she had everything. She was the favorite child because she was the only child, and we could say it and it wasn't wrong. And then Kason came, and what did he do? Man, he ripped that throne right out from underneath her, and he moved himself to the top. Why? Because he's the little one, right? So they tend to be described as the dethroner. Now, here's some positive attributes. They can be cooperative. They can be sociable. They can be peacemakers. Think about this. They can be peacemakers. Why? Because if they're in the middle, they're usually trying to separate the firstborn and the thirdborn from killing each other. So they tend to be very cooperative and much like peacemakers. That was exactly how my brother was. I have 2 siblings, a brother and a sister. I'm the oldest. My sister's the youngest. And my brother, he was just always the calmer one, a little bit more diplomatic. He just navigated situations. My sister and I were just total opposites, right? So that middle child tends to kind of be right there in the middle. They're great negotiators. Great negotiators. Parents, you need to know that because they're going to get you. They know what they're doing because they're in the middle, positioned very well. Let's look at some famous second-born. MLK. What was he? Where did he stand? In the gap. He was about peace. He was trying to bring solution. He was a great negotiator. He stood in the middle. Let's look at another one. Princess Diana. Remember her? It's been a little while. We don't talk about her as much. She was a special one. She too stood in the gap, was about peace. Great negotiators, but they're also great diplomats. This is your middle child. They are wonderful. They have the most meaningful marriages. They have the most meaningful relationships because they truly care. They also, they have a dark side too. They're rebellious. But here's why. They're rebellious because they weren't getting the attention. So they do something to try to get it. They can be rebellious. They can be secretive. Be a little bit more quiet to themselves. They can choose friends over family. They oftentimes, and this is important, they fail to admit when they need help, and they also tend to hide their real feelings. So for those of you with middle children, second child, you need to note this. Your kids, your second-born, and my brother was this way. My mom would have to really talk long and hard with him to try to pull out what was really going on. Me, I just yelled it and then walked out of the room. My sister, a little more dramatic, but we both easy to come out. But with him, it took a little extra care. So as parents, we got to note this about our middle children. They're going to tend to hold back. They're going to tend to be a little bit more reserved, but they tend to have the most meaningful relationships, the most meaningful marriages. Okay, let's look at the lastborn. Where are you at, lastborns? Couple of you? Great. Okay, so lastborn children. If firstborns rule the world, then lastborns want to change it because they want to get rid of the firstborn being in charge. Lastborn children, they have incredible traits. They're charming. They're likable. They're creative. They're free-spirited, right? They are a little bit more free-spirited and careless, and here's why. It's because you lowered the standard for them most likely. Most likely, you said, Okay, no problem, right? Your firstborn had to be home at 5 p.m. Your lastborn, they're out till 2, and you're like, just make sure you don't die. We're good. Right? It's just a different world. And so they tend to be a little bit more carefree, a little bit more free-spirited. They're a little loosey-goosey because that's the environment in which they were being developed. You may remember when your firstborn came, you were taking pictures or video, right? You had the new camera, and you were just filming away. And then the second-born came, and you're like, well, did you get the camera? I forgot it. No problem. Oh, we got it this time. And so the third-born came, you're like, camera's broken. We don't even have one. But we'll remember this somehow, right? Somehow. Then the pacifier. Remember the pacifier? The firstborn, if it dropped on the ground, you put it in the decontamination system, the dishwasher, on sanitized. You were making sure it was clean. By the third-born, you're like, hey, just wipe it on your pants. It'll be fine. By the fourth-born, you just say, use your finger. We don't even need a pacifier. It's just radically changed, right, as we went forward. So we see our last-born children tend to respond this way. But here's what's interesting. Last-born children, they are the number one car salesman. Yeah, you need to note that, all right? When your last-born's looking at you deceivingly, it's probably because they got something going on. They're about to sell you on it, and you're probably going to fall for it if you're not prepared for what's coming. Now, they too have a dark side. Here's what it is. They're manipulative. They're flaky. They're spontaneous. They decide with feeling rather than fact. Does that bother some of you, right? If it feels right, we'll do it. If not, not with facts, with feelings. And they tend to have very shallow relationships. They also can be financially irresponsible, which is interesting because guess what? Donald J. Trump was a fourth-born. He was the last child. So it's not always a guarantee you'll be financially irresponsible, but you have the tendency to possibly go that way. I also think with Trump, it makes sense. He's always wants to be the center of what? Of attention, with his Twitter account or with his speeches, whatever it may be. Let's look at some famous ones. I skipped. Let's go back for a sec. Look at some famous last-born. Remember this guy? Johnny Depp. Yeah, he plays some crazy characters, doesn't he? You've seen him in everything. Free-spirited. Creative. Look at the next one. Remember this guy? Jim Carrey? Little crazier. Now, some of you are like, I'm offended by this. Why are you showing me these pictures? But here's the thing. Both of these guys are extremely successful. So it's not a lack of being able to be successful. It's just how you do it. Their type of movies, compared to Sylvester Stallone, Angelina Jolie, who are all firstborn children, radically different types of movies, right? Yet they were all highly successful. And so how we grow up in the order in which we were born tends to have a radical effect on how we operate. And finally, let's look at our only children. Last one. Only children. Now, these are going to be some similarities to the firstborn, just on steroids, okay? So let's look at some positive things. And some of you have an only child right now. And you're about to rock their world, okay, with the second kid. And that means your world's going to get rocked, so just get ready. Okay, so let's look at some positives. First, they tend to be perfectionists. They tend to be very logical, confident. They're mature. Why do you think they're mature? Because you probably stopped goo gaga talking to them at the very beginning. You just started talking to them like an adult. And so they tend to mature quickly. They tend to have more adult conversations because that's all they're around. They're not around other kids. So they tend to grow up a little bit faster. They tend to be more mature. They tend to be ambitious, and they tend to be highly achieved. They love to achieve, just like our firstborn children. Now, let's look at a couple of these real quick. Samuel L. Jackson, remember him? Very, very successful. We could have a contest. How many movies of his could you name? None of us would be able to name them all unless we use Google, and I don't think Google could even name it all. Here's another one. Tiger Woods. Now, forget his indiscretions just for a moment. When it comes to golf, if not now, at some point and multiple times throughout his life, he has been what? Without a doubt, the greatest golfer that's ever played the game. Why? Because he grew up playing the game, focused on one thing. In fact, this is crazy. I watched him when he was a kid. He was probably 10 or 11. He was on a news channel. They were doing a special on him before he was ever Tiger Woods. And he was just putting the ball over and over and just getting, not hole-in-ones, but he was just repeatedly hitting it in. And his dad was standing right there, and they were talking through, how much does he practice? He's so good. He's going to be great one day. And you betcha he grew up to be the Tiger Woods. Only children have a different kind of achievement level, because all focus and attention's on them. But guess what? They tend to be super selfish because they're not used to sharing, are they? They're not used to extending anything. It's all about them. And so their dark side comes to life. They're self-centered. They're highly critical. They can be impatient. They can think they're always right. Sometimes they're right, but most of the time they just think they're right. And they can be control freaks. Why? Because they are on their own. And so these habits have been formed in them by lack of other communities. Now, just like the firstborn, our only children are also capable of highly successful relationships and marriages. And by the way, in case I missed it, for the lastborns, you tend to have the funnest relationships and the funnest marriages. That's what it looks like for the lastborn children. Now, there's a couple of things. Some of you may be going, okay, that's good, and I could see some of those coming to life, but some of that, maybe there's something missing, or what about this? And so here's a few exceptions. I can't list them all, but here's a few. First of all, birth order starts over at a certain point in time. Some of you have a lot of kids. So look at this. Birth order starts over when one of a few things happen. Number one, there's an age gap. Typically 5 years or more, it starts over. So after 5 years, you basically have a firstborn again. Most likely because all that stuff you used to use, you got to throw out and you're starting over again. You got a new car seat, you got new clothes, you got all that. So an age gap of typically 5 years or more will do that to you. Gender switch. If your firstborn was a boy and then your secondborn was a girl, you can't use the blue, right, for the pink. And so oftentimes they're getting new things and you'll tend to see a little bit more of a firstborn attributes even though they are a secondborn gender switch, though that's not always a guarantee. And then after your fifth child will typically be a firstborn, sixth would be a secondborn, and it kind of starts over from there. If you're a blended family, well, you need to understand there will be a period of disorientation. There will be a period where your two firstborn link up together and they're trying to figure out their place. Who's going to actually be the leader? Who's going to be behind? There will be a disarray there. Honestly, there'll be a little bit of a disarray. But it'll settle out and it'll work, but it's something to note. You also want to look out for a reverse birth order. What this would look like is, for Sarah and I, we actually talk about this quite a bit. We're both firstborns. And so what happens if we're not careful, we start to imply our traits onto our kids. So our firstborn nature comes out of both of us. Basically, it's times 2, and it starts getting dumped on our kid, and so they react negatively. Some of you had the other experience where your parents were so fun, free-spirited, they never had a schedule, and you were like, never again. And you became basically a firstborn because you repelled what you grew up with. So the reverse birth order. And then a couple other things is health and mental illness. If you have a child that has some form of a mental illness or a disability, they will tend to carry the traits of your last born, okay, because you're going to continue to treat them because they're just going to require more attention and more care. So regardless of their birth order, they will eventually acquire the attributes of the last-born child. Divorce, economic status, death of a sibling, all these things play effect. So why is this important? Well, hopefully, first of all, you begin to look at each other and go, wow, I kind of see some of this in you, and I feel some of this in myself. But then hopefully we can look at our kids and go, okay, this is awesome about our firstborn child. This is kind of scary. We need to keep an eye on this. Let's watch this. Now, we don't want to fight this. Remember, this is part of the Lego. This is something that God's given them. He has used the family in which they were born into, the family that they were born, He's using you to help form them and using their environment to develop them as a man or as a woman. So we don't want to fight it, but we do want to understand it so that we can be out on the lookout for the things that could be potentially dangerous, and we want to be excited and help to enhance the things that are positive. The big one is for those of you, for instance, with a middle child. What you would want to note is you want to note that they tend to be reserved. They tend to not talk about their feelings. They're going to be harder to open up with. You have to plan accordingly as you're parenting them so that you can get through that shell or that wall and help them walk through whatever it is they're going through. So there's something like that for each kid. But understanding this hopefully can be helpful. And looking at the differences, we can better understand each other in our marriages, and then hopefully we work together to bring all that and really glorify God with what He has laid in front of us.